Hello, this is Meet the Writers. I'm Georgina Godwin. My guest today is the winner of the 2024 Women's Prize for Fiction, which is awarded annually by the Women's Prize Trust, the UK charity which enriches society by creating equitable opportunities for women in the world of books and beyond. This year, the prize went to an American author with Sri Lankan heritage for her deeply moving, powerful second novel, Brotherless Night, which depicts a family fractured by the Sri Lankan Civil War. V V Ganeshananthan, welcome to Meet the Writers. Please, can I call you Sugi?
Yes. Thank you so much for having me.
What does VV stand for?
It stands for Vasugi Vani, but I usually only got called that when I was little and I was in trouble, so...
Now, we're talking the morning after the prize.
We are.
And it was a late night for many of us. I'm sure you were celebrating. How are you feeling today?
Still stunned, still excited, still awash in the good feelings of being in such a wonderful community of readers and writers.
Let's take you right back to the beginning, because this book has been almost really gestating for a lifetime. Can we start with your family background? I know that your parents came from Sri Lanka.
They did. They emigrated to the U.S. in the 70s when a lot of professionals came on professional visas for things like medicine or engineering, and they stayed.
What did they do?
My father is a physician. Well, he's a retired physician, and my mother is also retired, and she was a Montessori nursery school teacher.
You were born in Connecticut?
I was.
Tell me more. You grew up there?
I didn't grow up there, actually. I was born there, and I lived there for the first few years of my life, and then we moved to Maryland, where I did my K through 12 schooling.
And were there a lot of stories around? Were there a lot of books around when you were growing up?
My parents were very big on encouraging me to read, and I loved to read, so I read a lot. I went to the library a lot. I went to the bookstore a lot. So I was very fortunate to have great access.
Mm-hmm. When did you first become aware of the Sri Lankan War?
I don't really remember not being aware of it, actually, because I think so in 1983, which is probably the date that many people would use to mark the start of the war, I would have been 3 years old. And I think my first memories of television are probably of the war.
Mm-hmm. And family stories? Was there family involvement within all of that trauma?
Well, I think the whole country in different ways was affected, and certainly my family roots are in an area that was heavily affected. So, yeah, I think, I grew up with stories, and also in both Connecticut and Maryland, there are Tamil communities and Sri Lankan communities that have connections there. And so I think many people were thinking about that.
I'm not sure how much our listeners will know about the history of the war and the divide between the Sinhalese and the Tamils. And I wonder if you could just give us the brief background on that.
Sure. I will say that the brief background is a little bit impossible, which is some of what the book is actually about. But Sri Lanka has multiple ethnic communities and complex lineages. It was colonized multiple times. The Sinhalese are the ethnic majority. They are primarily Buddhist. There are significant Tamil communities. There's a community that is primarily Tamil-speaking and Muslim, and they're politically distinct. Kind of within the Tamil community, there are multiple Tamil-speaking communities. So there's a population that came over kind of during British colonialism and worked on tea plantations, and they're still obviously plantation workers and their descendants, as well as Tamil populations that were there before that. So there are Eurasian populations. There's an indigenous population. So it's much more politically complex than it often appears in the West. And one of the goals of this book was to kind of disrupt a binary. Successive Sri Lankan governments, dominated primarily by the Sinhalese, kind of after the British left, they instituted policies like Sinhala-only language, et cetera. And so during the British colonial period, Tamil people were often working in positions like as civil servants, et cetera, et cetera. And so there was a perception that there needed to be inequalities redressed. And then I think that created different inequalities. And so after kind of discrimination by successive Sri Lankan governments, in Tamil areas, militant groups started to form with the notion of a separate state. The most famous of those groups is the Tamil Tigers, who claim to be the sole representatives of Tamil people. There were also other Tamil militant groups, which are often forgotten, but were significant, which were sometimes in conflict with each other. So all of that was going on. And then there were also Indian peacekeeping forces present in Sri Lanka during the first decade of they came in 1987 and were there and were also players in this. So the international community, et cetera. So my book covers the first decade. So I'll sort of stop with that part. And then it kind of skips ahead to the war ended in 2009. And my narrator, Sashi, is speaking from the vantage point of New York in 2009. She's looking back on her childhood in the Tamil town of Jaffna, Sri Lanka, where as the war begins, she's trying to become a doctor. And she's facing all of that. She's very excited about becoming a doctor, and then she becomes one, but not in the way that she expected.
Mm-hmm. I want to circle back to the book in a moment. I just want to talk about the process of getting to that point. When did you know you were a writer?
I think for a pretty long time, kind of like always knowing about the war, because I, again, was really just so incredibly supported by my parents in reading as much as I wanted and being encouraged to write and be creative. My mother in particular is like very encouraging about art, loves to make things, and encouraged play of a certain kind. And that was a really wonderful space to be in. And then I think writing was just a natural outgrowth of reading, as it is for so many of us. And yeah, both of my parents were always, telling me I could do whatever I wanted.
And you did. I mean, you went to Harvard. You edited the magazine Crimson.
Yeah, I edited it was the newspaper. Yeah, which was quite a job.
I can imagine. And you're still involved with it now.
I'm on the graduate board. I think that there's a ton of Crimson alums in journalism and in other fields. I just ran into someone about 10 minutes before coming here, which was really a surprise and delightful. And I hadn't seen that person, and that was the connection. So it's an incredible organization and network of people. And I think that a lot of the skills that I learned there are things that I've taken into my fiction.
Yeah. Well, I'm really interested in that journalism school experience. Could you elaborate on it?
Sure. So in college, I was on the Harvard Crimson, which was a daily newspaper and had different sections. And then I went and got an MFA. Well, first I worked on a magazine. I worked at the Atlantic Monthly for a year. And then I went and got an MFA. And then a little bit after that, I went to journalism school at Columbia. And they were starting a new degree for people who had already worked in journalism to specialize in certain things. And I had been primarily an education reporter. I'd covered higher education. And that was my interest. And then I shifted to kind of, after the MFA, arts and culture. So I studied the lives of artists. How do we interview artists? Are artists articulate about their own work? It's funny to be talking about this now. And, what is the history of writing about, or the theory of writing about dance or music? Or how do we write about violence without, what are the ethics of writing about violence? And how do you not just make it sort of voyeuristic, mm-hmm. right? So what is the history of writing about violence in the United States? What images have people seen? What are the reference points? I had an incredible teacher, Elisa Solomon, who had been the Village Voice theater critic, and she was astonishing, and I learned so much with her and with my classmates. And while I was in journalism school, I sold my first novel, and actually also this one, and that was the fall of 2006.
Your first novel actually came out of your senior thesis, right? Love, Marriage.
Yeah, it was my undergraduate thesis. The earliest drafts were my undergraduate thesis.
And how was that book received?
It was well received. I think it's in North America, still in print. I'm not sure of the situation here, but it is told in a very different style than this book. It's short lyrical vignettes. I began writing it in a class with Jamaica Kincaid, who was an incredible teacher and really taught you to bear down on every sentence. And yeah, that was an incredible experience. And then didn't touch it when I was getting my creative writing degree, and then went back to it at journalism school, and there it went out the door.
So you said you sold that one and Brotherless Night both in 2004?
2006, yeah.
2006.
It was a different economic time. It was before the crash. And so they both went to an editor at Random House who was actually someone I had known for a very long time. And that was a really great and fruitful relationship. She's no longer in publishing, and I was inherited by a completely brilliant and wonderful editor who helped me to get to the finish line.
Well, and that was some time coming. I mean, astute listeners will have picked up the fact that it was sold in 2006. It's only just come out.
Yes, Random House and Viking were very patient. So yeah, my editor, Caitlin, helped me to think about what would help me to get to the end, because it was a long process that didn't have a very clear shape at different points.
So I'm interested in when you wrote the book, because it was sort of coming out of you at the end of the war, but you sort of returned it to the beginning?
Yeah, I think at the beginning of writing it, what I was obsessed with, what I was really fixated on was the end of the war, which a lot of people I think were fixated on and actually still are. And I can understand why, because it was such a cataclysmic moment when we saw so much harm. But then as I was researching my first novel, I found a piece of research that was interesting to me, a hunger strike. Then I wanted to write about it, but I didn't want to write about it from the position of the hunger striker. So I invented someone who was watching him, and that turned out to be my narrator.
Right. And the sort of 18 years or so that it took to come together, that's not just sitting there and thinking about it and doing the research. It's writing and it's rewriting. I'm interested in that rewriting process and what prompts that. What makes you say this just doesn't work anymore?
That's a great question. Well, I think for me it's mostly instinct, because what brings the story to me is the voice of a character. And then when the voice starts to kind of go out of tune, you're like, that doesn't belong here. So there were moments, like there were significant chunks of the book that were cut, whole storylines, hundreds of pages probably, that are elsewhere and should remain there. Yeah, so, of course, like some of that time is false starts.
On the very first page of the book, you use the word terrorists 6 times. And I'm really interested in that description and what you mean by the word terrorist and what you think it means to the rest of us in relation to the war.
Sure. It's the character of Sashi really directly addressing the audience, the readers. And it's, I think, very intentionally a provocation to sort of say, you use this word, so I'm going to use this word. And right, it's there to make everyone a little bit uncomfortable. What do you think it means? Who do you think those people were before you called them that? What other words might have applied to them? And right, I started the book in 2004, so I wasn't too far after 9/11. But also I come from a community where that word terrorist had been slung at us long before that. I mean, I'd meet someone and they'd be like, oh, you're a Sri Lankan Tamil, you must be a tiger. And, oh, that's so hilarious. It's just actually a bit tiresome. So to think about how we use that language, how we might talk about violence and also nonviolence in a more useful way, because I think what the word terrorist does is you've sort of made it so you've justified not talking to those people anymore. Mm.
What's the power of writing in the subjunctive?
Oh, have you been listening to other things I've said? I like the subjunctive. I think I'm maybe a little bit, I like a what if, because it leads you down a road that's maybe a series of decisions that changes who the character is. And I think my characters are often thinking about what if they had done something different. And I have found that when I think about this time, or when I would talk to other people who would think about this time, many of us were kind of hunting in the story for like the place where things could have gone differently. Mm.
Mm. I mean, your characters are fiction largely, but there is one real one. That's Rajni Thirunagama.
Rajni Thirunagama. Dr. Thirunagama was a member of University Teachers for Human Rights, Jaffna. She taught anatomy at the University of Jaffna's medical school. She's actually not the only inspiration for a character in the book. There are a couple of others, but I think she's probably the best known. And she wrote very eloquently about what it was like to live in a society that had been militarized and how she tried to resist that, how her students and colleagues and other members of civil society tried to resist it, and how the community changed. She wrote very eloquently about violence against women and about the Indian peacekeeping forces and Sri Lankan security forces and being, trying to be a person who spoke openly as much as she could. Mm.
I'm very interested too in the role of medicine, the fact that she's studying to be a doctor and that there are these other medical storylines, if you like. Why see it that way? What was the impetus for that?
Well, I think I'm very interested in medicine.
Because of your father?
Maybe because of my father, probably. I also just find it, it's just fascinating, a friend of mine who's a writer in Sri Lanka was talking to me recently, and she asked me kind of a question about medicine and storytelling, and which was a helpful way to frame it in that, right, doctors take histories. Like you go in and the way to get the best care for yourself is to tell the story of your body effectively and to remember as much of it as you can, like provide as much context. And some of us are not very good narrators of our own bodies. And I'm like a very educated patient. My father was a physician, and like I have a lot of privilege in that regard. And I still sometimes, will go in and forget things that have happened to me. Mm-hmm. So what does it mean to kind of recount that story? And I think also I'm interested in the life of the mind, but the life of the mind is connected to the life of the body. And to write books that are looking at bodies with a kind of intensity was interesting to me. Mm. So yeah, my characters are dealing with real, like, kind of action-oriented problem solving, like, oh, a patient has come in with this. And also they're aware of their own mortality given the context. So
in a heightened sort of way.
Yeah. But I think also, I'm maybe just a little bit of a nerd for diagnosis. I like to I'm like, oh, what are the symptoms and how would you do that? Yeah. I like to hear about how a doctor would look at a patient and think about it.
Yeah. Now, the debate about cultural appropriation is, I think, dead and buried. We all appreciate the fact that to be a novelist, it's about empathy and it's about writing about people that you are not and places where you are not. But was there a problem about writing about Sri Lanka when you weren't there and these were things you hadn't experienced?
Sure. I mean, I think if you think about historical fiction, the majority of it is written by people who haven't experienced it. So I do think like there are ways that people react to me specifically. Like if I were a different person writing about this, or if it were 40 years in the future, that would be maybe a different conversation. Perhaps because of my background as a journalist, I appreciate the value of, I don't know, kind of write what you know, but also you can know more. Yeah. And I don't really like the notion of myself as an unapproachable identity. Like I would rather be in conversation with someone who, even if they're failing, is considering me a person and is approaching me. So I thought, I don't know, like some of this book was like a test of how hard can you listen and how much could someone in the diaspora understand what this period might have been like. And then also the fact that I thought that this period deserved the same kind of attention that any other, like why shouldn't there be historical fiction about 1980s Sri Lanka? And in fact, this is not the only book really set there. So like why wouldn't it get that kind of attention, and why wouldn't it merit that attention from someone anywhere in the world? Yeah.
I mean, I'm really interested in what you say about the diaspora because I'm from Zimbabwe and obviously outside of the country now, but there's a huge Zimbabwean diaspora community who still feel all that stuff, who still have a right to talk about it, who still have a right to write about it. And I guess that gives me a window into what you're saying, because even if we're not there, we're still experiencing it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's in some ways it can be a different experience. And I do think, right, particularly in the context of the Sri Lankan Civil War, there's a lot of value to thinking about how the diaspora has acted and how it can be held accountable. And I don't just mean the Tamil diaspora, but right, members of different diaspora communities were stakeholders in the conflict, and sometimes were like a lot of money goes from outside Sri Lanka to Sri Lankans. And like, what does that mean? I also think you can't really expect all of those people to abscond and say, like, it's none of our business anymore. Because, I mean, some of those people left because of issues in the country. And then what are you saying by taking them out of the dialogue?
How do you get both sides of the story?
I think for me, a lot of it was about learning that there were more than two sides of the story. And I had a lot of people who had lived through that time, and particularly exceptional scholars, really emphasized to me that other people can frame it as Sinhalese versus Tamil, but like maybe you would say instead, more precisely, government security forces versus Tamil militants, because that's actually not the same thing. That there's also not just to talk about the other populations and other communities that don't belong to those ethnic groups, that the borders between the ethnic groups are porous. So sort of every time someone draws a line in the sand, to go and sort of very carefully take your pen and mess up the line so that it's not there anymore, and to write the story that way. Because, you had people from different communities in places where maybe based on stereotypes you wouldn't necessarily expect them politically, like the way the story is told in other places. Like, why shouldn't those people get to tell their own stories? And that, I think, was the other part of thinking about how to tell the story ethically. Like, doesn't mean I'm telling everyone's story. It's not like I took a survey, but to take in other people's perspectives and ideas and try to listen, and even if I didn't agree, to try and think about what it meant that they had a different perspective. And so I think it's a book that is, in some ways, trying to decenter narrative authority.
And it's a book about women, really.
It is a book about women.
Would you call it a feminist novel?
Oh, 100%. It's 100% a feminist novel.
Yeah. I love the way that it is the women and just ordinary people in general that we're hearing about. This is a really, I mean, people have called it heartbreaking. They've said it's a story of survival. It's a story of connection too. Why, how does that connection work?
Well, I think there's a lot of different ways in the book that connection appears. And of course, you know, the title of the book is Brotherless Night, and my narrator, Sashi, is the fourth of 5 children. She's the only sister. So she has 4 brothers. And so we see her connection to her brothers. She's close to her brothers. And it's also obviously a gendered relationship. But she's not merely someone who's influenced by their actions. She's also someone who takes her own actions. She develops a strong network of women in different spaces who are people who she turns to, including her teacher, who's a character who is based on Rajani Tharanagama. She has a group of friends at university. She has a feminist book club. She's a medical student. She has a friend in the arts stream. You know, she has older women friends in the community. So she finds herself in a lot of positions to need the support of other women and also to provide that support herself. And yeah, it's definitely intended to be a feminist novel.
And I mean, it seems to me then that she goes through the process of research and political education exactly as you have done. How close is she to you?
Well, I wish. Not exactly as she had done. But I think, yeah, I mean, we share certain interests. And I think, right, so many people also lived in proximity. I think that was one of the things I was interested in depicting, right? What if you just live in proximity to a movement? What does it mean to be someone who's adjacent to something like that? What kind of agency do you have? Do you even know all the time, like, what you're choosing to do? And so I think sometimes thinking about the ways in which, right, like, I obviously, like, my experience is very different than hers. Like, I live with a lot of, like, I live in the U.S. I have a lot of privilege. But also, I mean, some of the things that occurred in that time are things that affect the diaspora today. I mean, I come from a community that has a history of different kinds of surveillance that has had a real impact on us, I think. It certainly at least has had an impact on me, right? There's a whole vocabulary that can be like a euphemism for the war, or even just like particular terms that were invented to address certain things, or ways that you talk about certain kinds of violence, or ways you don't talk about it at all.
You talked about how she has this wonderful community and she can reach out to people. And I just wonder, looking back at the event last night, where it just felt we were in this amazingly warm community of women, of writers, of readers, of publishing adjacent people, and how that helps you or perhaps doesn't with your own writing. Is it helpful to be within a community, or do you just want to be on your own? How much help do you get perhaps from other writers?
I think I get so much help from other writers. I now have been so lucky to have these 2 exceptional experiences. I was at the Carol Shields Prize in Toronto last month. And in both cases, to spend time with the other writers, to engage with their work, to hear them read. I mean, it's amazing. I mean, I think I maybe said this last night in my speech, that at the reading, I wanted so much. I was in exactly the place where I wanted to be. And I also, hearing all of them read, I really wanted to kind of rush back to my desk and kind of be in conversation with what they were reading and saying, because it was so powerful. I want to say that I'm particularly thrilled that there's a nonfiction prize now, because I think the presence of women in nonfiction is so important. And so to double the size of that conversation was great too. I was so happy that we were all there. It was a lot of fun. And I think that oftentimes at things like this, you start a conversation that goes on for years and affects your work, and you get to make a friend.
And so you're rushing back to your desk tomorrow. You're flying back home.
I am.
What's on your desk?
A stack of books. My podcasting setup, actually.
Oh, tell us about your podcast before you go.
Sure. I have co-hosted since 2017 Literary Hub's fiction nonfiction podcast, which is about the intersection of literature and the news. And my wonderful co-host is Whitney Terrell, who is also a novelist/journalist. And we have a lot of the same interests, but we have read a lot of different things. So it's been a real treat for the past several years to be in conversation with Whitney, to be in conversation with the writers he knows, to put them in conversation with the writers I know, to talk to writers about how the news affects what they choose to write about and about the craft decisions that go into their narrative and dramatic choices as they're choosing how to tell those stories. Like when you think about the first person plural, what does that have to do with a story about immigration? Or, what is the intersection of form and content when it has to do with political content and the news and literature? And those are some of my favorite questions. And it has been really, really helpful to work on that show and to think about this book, actually.
You're sort of avoiding the question, which is really what's on your desk. Apart from the books you're going to read and your podcasting, you know what I'm really asking.
I have my fingers in several different projects at the moment, and I'm not really sure which one will stick. So I think I have some interest in writing something funny. During this period of time, I taught different humor classes a few times, and I think that's a totally different terrain for me. So that might be very interesting. Or who knows, maybe just another novel,
another award-winning book.
I don't know. I guess, I'm interested in maybe exploring something new, like short stories or essays, which I haven't done it at book length. But also, the novel is my first love.
Sugi, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Brotherless Night by V V Ganeshananthan is published by Penguin, and it's the winner of the 2024 Women's Prize for Fiction. It's out now. Go to bookshop.org to purchase your copy. You've been listening to Meet the Writers, thanks to the producer Tamsin Howard. And you can download this show and previous episodes from our website or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Georgina Godwin. Thank you for listening.